The former home of Queen frontman Freddie Mercury is for sale in London. Built in 1907, the Kensington property features a bar, a library.
When Freddie Mercury died on November 24, 1991, the headlines all said the same thing. Rock had lost its brightest, boldest voice. Fans lit candles outside a quiet townhouse in Kensington. Radio stations played Bohemian Rhapsody on a loop, and newspapers scrambled to sum up a man who never fit inside a single sentence. But grief has a way of stopping at the surface. Behind the tall brick walls of his home, a much smaller circle of people were dealing with something the public wouldn't understand for years. The private world Freddie had built for himself, piece by piece, room by room, and the things inside it that revealed just how much of the real man he had kept hidden from view. This is the story of that house, the life that filled it, and the moment his closest friends finally saw all of it laid bare. Long before stadiums chanted his name, he was a boy named Farrokh Bulsara. Born in September 1946 in Zanzibar, then a British protectorate off the coast of East Africa. His parents, Bomi and Ja, were Parsis, descendants of Zoroastrians who had left Persia centuries earlier and settled in India, in a coastal region of Gujarat. Bomi worked as a cashier for the British colonial administration, a steady, unremarkable job that gave the family a foothold in a corner of the world defined by empire and transition. Farrokh's childhood was split between continents almost from the start. Much of his early schooling happened not in Zanzibar, but in India, where he was sent to live with relatives and later enrolled at a British-style boarding school outside Bombay. It was there, away from his parents, that the boy began to take shape into someone else. He learned piano as a young child, picked up a genuine, almost obsessive love of stamp collecting from his father, and by his early teens had already formed his first band, a school outfit that covered the rock and roll acts filtering in from the West. Teachers and classmates from that era have described a kid with an uncanny memory for melody, someone who could hear a song once on the radio and pick it out on a piano within minutes, note for note. It was also during these school years that Freddie first appeared. Classmates started using the nickname, and unlike a lot of childhood nicknames, this one stuck for life. By the time he returned to Zanzibar as a teenager, he was already a different person than the boy who'd left. More confident, more musical, still shy in most everyday settings, but capable of an entirely different presence the moment he had an audience. That return to Zanzibar didn't last. In early 1964, the islands erupted into violence during what's now remembered as the Zanzibar Revolution, an uprising that toppled the ruling sultanate and led to brutal, widespread violence against Arab and South Asian residents. The Bulsaras, like thousands of others, fled with almost nothing. They resettled in England, in the unglamorous suburban sprawl of Feltham, Middlesex, a jarring contrast to the warmth and color of the world Freddie had grown up in. The family moved between a few modest addresses before settling into a house on Gladstone Avenue, and it was there that the next chapter of his life quietly began. England gave Freddie an education in art rather than music, at least officially. He studied at a local polytechnic before earning a diploma in graphic design from Ealing Art College in 1969. That training wasn't wasted. The visual instincts he developed there would later show up in the way he thought about stage design, album art, and most famously, the ornate crest he sketched for his band. But diplomas didn't pay rent. In those lean years, he took whatever work he could find, including loading luggage at Heathrow Airport, and sold vintage clothing and scarves at a stall in a London market alongside a young drummer named Roger Taylor, who would later remember him simply as an eccentric, funny friend. Not yet the singer the world would come to know. People who crossed paths with him during this period often described two very different Freddies, a quiet, almost withdrawn young man in daily life, and a completely different creature the instant he had a microphone in his hand. He cycled through a handful of short-lived bands in the late 1960s, one that leaned into blues rock, another that barely got off the ground before falling apart. None of them worked. To an outside observer, it might have looked like a string of failed attempts by someone who didn't quite have what it took. In hindsight, every one of those false starts was simply preparation for the band that was about to change everything. In 1970, Freddie joined an existing group featuring guitarist Brian May and drummer Roger Taylor, And it was Freddie, not either of them, who pushed hardest for a new name, Queen. He loved that the word sounded regal, dramatic, and instantly memorable. And he wasn't put off in the slightest by its other connotations. If anything, that layered meaning was part of the appeal. Bassist John Deacon joined not long after, completing a lineup that would go on to define arena rock for the next 2 decades. Around this same time, Freddie made the choice to formally drop the surname Bulsara and became, legally, Freddie Mercury, a name that matched the scale of what he was about to become. He also designed the band's now iconic crest himself, weaving together the astrological symbols of all 4 members into a single ornate coat of arms, crowned and framed by a phoenix. It was a small, personal touch that ended up representing something much bigger. A band built on contradiction, drama, and spectacle, long before a single record had been pressed. What followed is well documented, a run of albums and singles that reshaped what a rock song could sound like. Freddie's songwriting refused to sit still. One track might sprawl across shifting keys and operatic structure. The next might be 3 chords and pure, unfiltered fun. He openly admitted he could barely read sheet music, composing almost everything by ear at the piano, letting instinct do the work that formal training might have done for someone else. His vocal range only added to the mystique, a speaking voice that sat comfortably in the baritone register, paired with a singing voice that could leap into soaring tenor territory without visible strain. Records only tell half the story. Freddie Mercury's true medium was live performance, and everyone who ever shared stage or an audience with him seemed to agree on one thing. There was nobody else quite like him. He treated a crowd of 80,000 people the same way he might treat a room of 20, like every single person needed to feel personally addressed. Bandmates would later say he had a gift for reaching the person standing furthest from the stage, pulling them into the performance, as if there were no distance at all. That gift reached its absolute peak on July 13, 1985, during Live Aid at Wembley Stadium. Queen's 20-minute set is still regularly cited as one of the greatest live performances in the history of rock music. Dressed simply in jeans and a white tank top, Freddie had tens of thousands of people clapping and chanting in perfect unison, and his extended a cappella exchange with the crowd became one of the most replayed moments in music history. A little over a year later, in August 1986, Freddie took his final bow with Queen at Knebworth Park in front of a crowd approaching 200,000 people. He closed the night wrapped in a royal-style robe, a golden crown raised above his head. Those closest to him would later reveal that, just days earlier, he had quietly told Brian May he didn't think he'd be doing this much longer. Nobody in the audience knew it, but they were watching the final chapter of Freddie Mercury's live career unfold in real time. Off stage, the contradictions kept piling up. He was a self-taught pianist who eventually stepped away from the instrument on stage simply because he wanted the physical freedom to move, strut, and command space the way he did. He could write intricate, multi-part vocal harmonies one afternoon and knock out a simple rockabilly tune the next. He even picked up a guitar occasionally, just to prove to himself he could. His personal life followed a similarly unpredictable path. Much of the public narrative around Freddie centers on his relationships with men, but those closest to him have also spoken about meaningful relationships with women throughout his adult life. Actresses, close friends, people he cared for deeply outside of any public label. He was, by nearly every account, a man who resisted being defined by a single story, even in his most private moments. The relationship that shaped him most was with Mary Austin, whom he met in 1969, while she worked at a fashionable London boutique. At the time, Freddie was broke and still selling clothes at a market stall. Mary was younger, steady, and grounded in a way he wasn't. Their relationship deepened quickly, and for years she supported them financially while he chased a career that hadn't yet paid off. When success finally arrived, he proposed, and she accepted. Before the relationship shifted permanently once Freddie acknowledged his attraction to men. The romance ended, but the bond between them never did. Mary remained one of his closest confidants for the rest of his life, eventually working alongside his management and traveling with him. Freddie would later describe her as his common-law wife, and it was to Mary that he left the bulk of his estate, including his beloved Kensington home. Other relationships followed. A passionate connection with an Austrian actress known for matching his larger-than-life energy, and later, during his years living partly in Munich, a serious relationship with a German restaurateur who gave him a wedding band he wore for years afterward. But the relationship that carried him through his final chapter was with Jim Hutton, an Irish hairdresser he met at a London nightclub in 1985. Freddie referred to Hutton as his husband in every way that mattered, wore the ring Hutton gave him until the day he died, and built a genuine home life with him, both in London and later in Ireland. Hutton stayed by his side through the hardest years of his illness, right up to the very end. Away from romantic relationships, Freddie's cats were, by every account, treated like family. He would reportedly call home while on tour just to have someone hold the phone up so he could talk to them. And one of his cats, a favorite named Delilah, was even immortalized in a song written specifically for her. His home filled up over the years with Japanese art antiques and objects he collected with the same intensity he brought to songwriting. Each piece chosen deliberately, each one meaningful, in a way that wasn't always obvious to outsiders. Not every relationship in Freddie's orbit was built on loyalty. In the mid-1970s, a man named Paul Prenter entered his life, eventually becoming his personal manager and one of his closest advisors. For years, the arrangement seemed to work, even as rumors swirled about the true nature of their relationship. But by the early 1980s, cracks had started to show. Queen's more experimental, disco-influenced record in 1982 divided the band internally, and Brian May and Roger Taylor placed much of the blame on Prenter's influence over Freddie's creative direction. The album underperformed. Tensions with the rest of the band deepened, and Prenter's standing within Queen's inner circle began to erode. The final break came in 1987, when Prenter sold a deeply personal story about Freddie's private life to a British tabloid, revealing details about his relationship with Jim Hutton that Freddie had never intended to make public. It was a genuine betrayal, and one that reportedly stemmed, at least in part, from Prenter's own desperate circumstances. He was battling HIV himself at the time, and according to people close to the situation, felt cast aside after years of service with little financial security to show for it. Whatever the reasoning, the damage was done. After that experience, Freddie's already private world became even more tightly guarded. The number of people allowed close to him shrank considerably, and the walls around his personal life, both figurative and literal, grew taller. By the late 1980s, those closest to Freddie could see he was unwell, even though almost nothing was said out loud. Brian May later described an unspoken understanding among the band. Nobody pressed Freddie for details, and he offered almost none. He simply told them touring wasn't possible anymore, and that was the end of the conversation. It wasn't until a dinner with his inner circle in Montreux in 1989 that Freddie confirmed what many had already quietly suspected. Even then, according to people who were there, his primary concern wasn't sympathy or public disclosure. It was continuing to make music for as long as his body allowed it. The public got its last glimpse of Freddie performing alongside his Queen bandmates at the Brit Awards in 1990. After that, he retreated almost entirely into his London home, spending his remaining time with a small, trusted circle. His personal assistant, Jim Hutton, and Mary Austin. Tabloids speculated for years about his health, but nothing was ever confirmed publicly. That changed on November 23, 1991, just one day before his death. Freddie released a statement, crafted in his own words, confirming that he had tested positive for HIV and was living with AIDS. He explained that he had chosen to keep the diagnosis private in order to protect the people closest to him, but felt the time had come to speak honestly. He died the following day, November 24, 1991, from bronchial pneumonia brought on by complications of AIDS. He was 45 years old. Given the intense stigma surrounding AIDS at the time, his decision to speak publicly, even in his final hours, was viewed by many as an act of quiet defiance. Jim Hutton remained by his side until the very end, and would later describe their relationship as something that belonged entirely to the two of them, not something owed to public curiosity. Hutton passed away nearly 2 decades later, in 2010, after his own battle with cancer. Freddie purchased his Kensington home in 1980, at the absolute height of Queen's fame, paying roughly £500,000 for a Georgian-style property that friends soon nicknamed Garden Lodge. It sat behind a now famous green front door tucked away from a street, and it quickly became far more than a place to sleep between tours. It became an extension of Freddie himself. The house was a study in contradiction, much like the man who lived there. Ornate in places, deeply intimate in others. Loud in its color choices, peaceful in its layout. Victorian architectural details blended with a distinctly Japanese sense of calm, reflecting Freddie's genuine love of Japanese art and design, which he had cultivated over years of collecting. Mary Austin, who remained close to him until his death and later inherited the property, would describe walking through that green door for the first time as an instantly peaceful experience, the feeling of stepping into a true artist's home. And yet flamboyance was everywhere, especially in the mirrored dressing room where Freddie prepared before performances, perfecting the look the world would come to recognize instantly. Past that room sat his bedroom, tucked away as his final private retreat. Downstairs, bold saffron yellow walls greeted visitors, a color choice Freddie loved, specifically because it echoed the same warmth and energy he brought to the stage. The house's double-height drawing room held his piano, the very instrument on which Bohemian Rhapsody first took shape, note by note, long before it became one of the most recognizable songs ever recorded. Outside, Freddie had personally overseen the design of a garden inspired by Japanese aesthetics, magnolia trees, quiet water features, and carefully sculpted greenery, an almost unheard-of luxury in central Kensington. A music room and a private bar both looked directly out over that garden, and it's easy to imagine him there in the quiet hours, unwinding with a drink in hand while melodies took shape in his head. When Freddie died, Garden Lodge didn't simply get sold off or emptied out. Mary Austin, who inherited the home along with a significant portion of his estate, made the decision to preserve it almost exactly as he had left it, as though he might walk back through that green door at any moment and sit down at his piano again. For roughly 3 decades, the house stood as a kind of time capsule, holding on to both the beauty and the eccentricity that had defined Freddie's private world. It wasn't until Mary eventually chose to part with the property that the full scope of what Freddie had surrounded himself with became public. Ahead of the sale, more than 1,500 of his personal possessions were auctioned off, with proceeds directed toward AIDS charities, a fitting tribute, given how his own death had helped push conversations about the disease into the open. Among the items revealed to the public, an elaborate replica of a royal crown and velvet robe he wore during Queen's 1986 tour, worn with a knowing, theatrical grin that perfectly captured his sense of humor about his own stardom. Handwritten lyric sheets surfaced as well, offering a rare, unfiltered look at how some of his most beloved songs had originally taken shape on paper. Flamboyant stage costumes, personal antiques, and pieces of Japanese art that had quietly filled his home for years were suddenly visible to people who had only ever known Freddie as a voice and a silhouette on a stage. Perhaps the most unexpectedly moving item to go under the hammer was the green front door itself, covered from top to bottom in years of handwritten tributes left by fans who had gathered outside over the decades. Messages of gratitude, grief, and connection scrawled by strangers who felt, in some personal way, that they had known him. That single door ultimately sold for a figure nearly matching what Freddie had originally paid for the entire property back in 1980. By 2024, when the house itself finally came up for sale, its estimated value had climbed into the tens of millions, a staggering testament to how much the legend of Freddie Mercury had grown in the years since his death.